He became an artist at 70. So that's another model altogether of how you approach these different forms, which I also find very inspiring. So I might just get back to poetry.
The old Shillong is dying. I mean, the reading culture.
When did the first modern novels appear, the first modern poetry, which we still read?
How do you take in these observations, or how do you manage to pull them off?
But philosophy is the opposite of religion. It says you have to make your own meaning. You can't outsource it to God.
Hello everyone, my name is Alina Shajan and I have Suzila Pamshong with me. We are MA Creative Writing students, and today we have a very distinguished author, novelist, poet and philosopher Anjum Hasan with us. We welcome you, ma'am.
Thank you so much.
In this episode, we are going to talk about how she takes down her creative process and how she deals with the struggles and the powers that come of being a writer in a creative field. So let's get started. So in one of your interviews, you mentioned that you were a poetry snob in your 20s. I would be glad to know how you transitioned from being a poet or starting with poetry and then going into the fictional world or the non-fictional world, and how did you actually have to unlearn whatever you learned when you were writing poetry in order to write fiction or non-fiction?
Certainly there was a process of unlearning and also learning a lot of new things in order to write novels and short stories. And yes, I did believe in my 20s that poetry is the superior art because it comes from inspiration and you don't force the pace, as Nissim Ezekiel said in that wonderful poem, that poets don't force the pace. You have to be still and wait for the poetry to come. So I really believe that in my 20s, that I looked down on people who treated writing like a discipline, forced labor. You sit at your desk and hack out prose. And there were a number of reasons for why I think I gravitated towards fiction in my 30s, partly because I grew up in Shillong and then I moved out, and in my head, poetry was very much associated with this smaller city or big town that I grew up in, and that move sort of made me look at my life from a sort of an ironic distance. And fiction seemed a better form in which to write about it. There's another theory about poetry versus fiction, which comes from this novelist I admire called Milan Kundera. And he has a wonderful novel about a young poet called Life is Elsewhere, where he says that the lyrical attitude through which you write poetry is only possible in youth. And as you grow older, you sort of lose that innocence, let's say, or that unmediated relationship to your life. And he has this unforgettable line about how the novelist is born from the ruins of this lyrical world, of his lyrical world. And he does also talk about the ironical attitude, that you become ironical towards your youth and your preoccupations of your youth. And I think that's what happened to me. I sort of grew up. So that's one way of looking at it, but there's so many other ways in which writers combine both poetry and fiction. And we were talking a little earlier, Alina, and you mentioned Tagore. I think that's a wonderful example because Tagore, on the contrary, would not make that separation. For him, all the creative forms flow in and out of each other. It just depends on what mood you are in at a particular moment. So if the spirit seizes you, you write poetry. Otherwise, you dance, or you write a novel, or you build a house, or you just live. So life itself is creative, according to Kundera. So there's no such thing as stages, or you grow out of poetry. That wouldn't make any sense to him. And in fact, he started painting at 70. He became an artist at 70. So that's another model altogether of how you approach these different forms, which I also find very inspiring. So I might just get back to poetry someday.
So since you told us that you have been born and brought up in Shillong. So you mentioned in one of your writings, I think it's an article or an essay, where you said that the old Shillong is dying. I mean, the reading culture. And can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, in general, not just in Shillong, and how the reading culture is dying.
It's such a curious situation, Susie, and you would know well because you're very much still part of the city and you live there. Is that a lot of things around reading and writing have become more available, more public. Books are at the tips of our fingers. We can order books in a few minutes. There are literary festivals with writers who we would never have dreamt of meeting, now available to chat with. There are several literary festivals in Shillong itself. So on the one hand, things are much more accessible. On the other, I don't know if it's connected to the fact that they're more accessible, but that idea of the quiet, solitary space in which one reads seems to become harder and harder to access. And solitude itself has become a little bit suspect. I think people are really seeking connections, meeting, public events. There's a culture of events around literature. So I do feel that I grew up at a very different time where most of us were readers simply because love of reading, but also because there wasn't that much else to do. And that culture is sort of not, I don't see that much of it anymore in Shillong. I'm sure there are some younger people who read. There's a huge also growth in the number of young people simply in the city. So it's hard to generalize because it was a much smaller city when I was growing up. The population has grown to some, I think, 6 lakhs. When I was growing up, it was maybe a third of that. So there are readers, I'm sure, but the culture of reading, like a larger culture, that is something that really, I think now you sense that people are waking up to the fact that you need to encourage reading. And I noticed like even the government is organizing these library weeks and tying hands with organizations that promote reading. So trying to do those things. And I think if you're a reader yourself, that's, in a way, that's enough. You know, I feel it's enough to preserve your own love of reading, even if you can't convince others to be readers. Okay. Yeah.
During our class, I remember you mentioning that you cannot become a good writer without becoming a good reader. And that was really very surprising for me to hear because it was actually true as well. And what do you have to say to people who do not have a inkling to read but do have the passion to write?
Why do you say it's surprising to hear? Why did you say it's surprising
because
to hear that?
I know some people who do not read much, but they do write amazing work.
Okay.
So
that may be true, but on the whole, if you look at the history of literature, that's really our context when we write, no? And that history is of modern writing is at least like, let's say in India, let's limit ourselves to India. When did the first modern novels appear, the first modern poetry, which we still read? It's not that old, right? It's maybe since the 1900s, people started writing novels, early 1900s or late 1800s. So it's only a couple of 100 years old. And every writer who's come after those early writers has referred to that older tradition. You are part of a chain, right? Writing is connecting yourself to an existing chain of writers, even if you reject them. How can you reject them unless you've read them? You have to read to reject. So it's like, you know, the soil from which you grow, the air that you breathe, the water in which you swim. If you don't have all those elements, how will you be a writer? What will you grow out of? So this new attitude that you don't need to read in order to write, I think it's been created by the internet because that's a platform where anybody can write anything and share it. So it gives you this, I think to me that's an illusion, but it's a very persuasive illusion because a lot of people can write and get published and share through that medium.
It has become it's become a problem, especially with the coming of different publishing house.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So
People don't read, and they're writers.
They're writers, and then you sort of lose the ability to judge. How do you judge between one writer and another? Again, I think it's only if you're a reader and you've developed taste, right? And then you can say, okay, I have the discernment to say this is a reasonably good, this is excellent, this is not so good. So I think that if we are to really take it seriously as something, as a vocation, as a calling for all through our lives, not just as a hobby or a passing thing, then reading is going to be essential. If you just want to do it as a hobby, as a pastime, something that's fleeting, may not last for long, then of course you don't have to read. But it depends again on how seriously you take your writing.
From your writing, it is very visible that you are somebody who observes very deeply, especially when it comes to localization or when it comes to cities. You write about a lot of different cities. I've read your works where you have written about Bangalore, about Hyderabad, and about Shillong also. And every city, you have brought in the true aspect or the true elements of those particular cities out. So how do you take in these observations, or how do you manage to pull them off?
I think it's a process of learning that you are not important. You know, your own life, you are important as the observing eye, the observing mind. But, you know, sometimes as a younger person, you get very caught in your own journey. Like, what am I doing? How is it all going to work out? Everything, relationships, career, money, there's so many uncertainties, right? But for me, growing up, growing older, and I'm much, much older now, it's been a process of also trying to efface my own biography and putting myself into other people's shoes as much as that is possible. Because I haven't grown up in a very rooted community or society. So there's a plus and a minus. You feel lonelier, you're cut off. You don't have, you know, that immediate access to stories and a fund of experience from the community around you. But on the other hand, it makes you curious about everything. The whole world is basically your oyster, you know. You can sometimes I feel like every place I go to, there's a potential for a story in that city, in that environment. So it's like the way you attune yourself to a place. And of course, you're never going to get everything. There will be a local view that you will never be able to have. But if you just start thinking that your own discomfort is less important than the life of that place and your curiosity about other people's lives, then it's not so difficult. You know, and that's the process of learning, to efface yourself. For me, like the ideal thing to be, as filmmakers sometimes say, is like the fly on the wall. There's a school of filmmaking called fly on the wall, where it's as if the camera is just, it's not there. Like people are talking and behaving like, they're at home. And some filmmakers have that ability to capture people who are completely at home in their own skin. And you think, how is there a camera in this room? They're talking and behaving like themselves. Some documentary filmmakers can get so close to people that they can pull that off. Maybe because they've spent so much time with the family, or with the community, whoever, with the subject, that they don't even notice there's a camera. So for me as a writer, that's the ideal. How do I get so invisible that I'm like the fly on the wall, listening? That's my ideal. And that's, of course, hard for a human-sized fly. So,
yeah. But when you talk about, not having a local eye, even though, you observe everything so closely, and I've read most of your writing centers around the idea that, of the other and alienation and feeling like, since you stayed in Shillong and was raised in Shillong, I guess the word Dakar, the idea of dirty metaphorically and physically. You talk about that. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think the idea of outsider again has been a double-edged thing for me, because in my fiction especially, I've also explored how there can be a larger stereotype of the outsider in a city or in a community. And then there's also things that happen despite it or against it or in tension with that idea, which could be neighborliness, friendships, love affairs. So many things happen across divides as well. While there's this larger boundary or larger division, right, between people. So it's the tension that interests me, not the, and in Lunatic in My Head, my first novel, that's what I think for me animates it and makes it interesting, that there is the divide in the background, but in the foreground, there are also people who don't care about it and who are making sort of connections with each other despite it. But at the same time, of course, there's a history of violence, there's a history of antagonism, and you can't ignore or completely pretend that that doesn't exist. And I think for me, being an outsider has been a strength also. I have tried to make it a weapon of, sort of sharpen it in a way that it becomes my lens on things. And often writers have been outsiders, like the whole sort of modernist tradition in Europe, it was about the outsider. One of the most famous novels in the history of European modern literature is called The Stranger.
Yes.
Sometimes it's translated as the Albert Camus.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's translated as The Outsider.
Yes.
In French, I think it's The Stranger.
Yes.
So that outside eye gazing on reality, because you are sort of not, something is broken, right? Something has broken. You don't know. It needn't be that it's an ethnic divide only. It could be it's broken because of the history of violence in your society. I mean, the Second World War created a lot of alienation for writers. The First World War, in fact, Virginia Woolf has this essay where she says that writers in Europe till the First World War, they had an innocence about them. They took for granted, like up to the Victorians, that reality was the stable thing that would never change. But after the First World War, writers lost the ground beneath their feet because there had never been killing on that scale. It was the biggest mass killing in remembered history, right? So there's so many things that can make you an outsider. You could be an outsider even while you're an insider. And I think it's very rich to explore. So I'm still exploring that even in the book I'm writing right now, which is a book on Shillong. Again.
Okay.
But I need to grow. I can't go on talking about the same thing in the same way. So in this book, I think I'm putting myself to one side, my kind of experiences that are like mine, and I'm talking more about people who are insiders in some sense. There's more of the insider voice, but also finding out the tensions in their lives. Because it's not a simple thing to be an insider.
This is so interesting to know, because once you said in an old interview that you always wrote about characters that are losers and drifters like you. And then you said you want to try writing something which is different.
Yes.
And
so
you're doing this now.
This is now.
So I'm very happy about that.
Yeah, because I'm always drawn to loners and drifters, like I said in that interview. I'm very attracted to that figure. And if I let myself be driven by that instinct, then I will be writing similar books all my life, which is fair enough, but I also need to challenge myself. So with this book, which is not a novel, it's a nonfiction book, I want it to be a lot about people who are very rooted in the city of Shillong. Maybe they're insiders or outsiders. Many are actually insiders very much. And to explore, what are the tensions of being an insider even? And what are the strengths? And how do they make up this city of Shillong? So it's a mix of people, but it's not only about the alienated figure, because I think that's only one part of experience. It can't be everything.
Yeah. So when you said you're writing, when you come towards the ending, how do you know when and where to stop? Like, do you take a logical decision, or is it just out of instinct that you know that I'll have to stop here?
Well, when I start, I don't know when I'm going to stop, which is a bit dizzying because, you're sort of in looking down an abyss. You don't know how deep it is. And it's a bit unnerving, I think, to write any piece of fiction. But as I go along, I do have a rough plot and I do need things to be resolved, even if it's an open-ended piece of fiction. It shouldn't be too neat or too pat or have a moral or be too obvious, but it requires some resolution, So I need to work that out in advance. I'm not just writing in a complete sort of incomplete ignorance of where I'm going. At some point as I start writing, I need a set of directions because otherwise you're letting the reader down. You can't test the reader's patience by just giving them something that stopped abruptly. People come to fiction because they want meaning, they want structure, they want some sense of purpose and design. We look for that in fiction because that's the kind of structure and meaning we try to impose on our own lives, right? We're always trying to find meaning and create sort of direction from the circumstances that we're given or the choices that we make. So similarly in fiction, it should have a shape of some kind. So while I'm writing, I try to create that shape. So I already know how it's going to end before I finish.
So you just mentioned about meaning. So, and you are also somebody who studied philosophy formally. So do you think that works or writing should contain a philosophical element in almost everything that we write or that we produce?
I think we are all at heart philosophical as human beings, It's just that we might suppress it because we get so busy, like wondering what's for dinner and how many people have liked our posts, and how are we going to write our exams, or, everyday life is always taking over. But moments when we pause or something very life-changing happens, something really big happens, birth and death, or new relationships or huge changes, then we do pause and think, what meaning does this have for us? Right? We're forced to be philosophical in those moments. So I think that urge is there. We just don't give into it because it can be difficult to make sense of these large things. And often we turn to religion because religion is like, it makes sense for us. Then we don't have to think so much. If things happen, we can just say, oh, it's God's will and switch off. But philosophy is the opposite of religion. It says you have to make your own meaning. You can't outsource it to God, So I think it's there in all of us, and we've devised ways to shut it out. Religion being one, and everyday life being the other. So I think with my fiction, I'm just trying to dig into that a little bit, like characters who do pause and ask themselves those questions. And they're not particularly profound people. They're quite everyday, my characters.
People. Yeah.
They're quite, everyday, they have everyday lives, but they do have this core of reflection, which, like I said, I think every human being has. And I think it's important to create some space for that because we tend to live more and more functional lives. Even writers are living such busy functional lives that we don't have time to.
Yeah. That's why I was gonna ask, you told us in class, because we had the workshop, and you told us that you have been writing every day for almost 2 decades, right? Mm-hmm. How do you even manage that? How do you not get distracted?
It depends. I think most of humanity is made in a way that you need structure given from outside. That's why most of us have jobs, right? We need to go to a place where the structure is preordained. If you teach, then the teaching is already set. You just fit yourself into that. Or you work in an office, or you drive a train engine, or any job has a pre-existing set of rules that you just follow. And I think the human mind is easier that way. We need a role. And the thing with being an artist of any kind is that you have to create yourself that role. When I sit in the morning, or any writer sits, we don't know what we're going to do. we may decide that we're never going to write again. That possibility is always there. Nobody is telling us what to do. We have to. So that makes it both exhilarating and difficult. But I think the freedom outweighs the fear for me. The freedom to create my own world is incredibly exciting for me. And it's a huge privilege that I can do it still, So that's the only thing that drives you. You don't get distracted because you're enjoying it so much. And of course, there are moments of despair and you feel that your writing is going nowhere, or you're hitting a wall, or you're being repetitive, or you're sounding lame. There's so many moments of doubt through the day. But on the whole, it's just the joy of creating something from nothing and being told like, yes, there may be a handful of people who will read you and get some pleasure and joy out of it. That's a huge gift and a huge privilege. I think that's what keeps me going.
To really write like that as you do, I think we need to develop our voices, as you said, as writers. So if you were to give a kind of like an advice for aspiring writers, how to develop their voices, you can share.
Okay. How do young writers develop their voices? It's very hard when you're young, obviously, because you have so little experience. You've just started out. You haven't even lived life that much. So you will not have a voice to begin with unless you're a genius, right? And there have been some geniuses who wrote all their work, finished all their work in their 20s. But for the most of us common humanity, it will be very hard to have a voice when you're starting. So again, we come back to the thing of borrowing voices when you start. And I think I did quite a lot of that because I was reading so eclectically, so widely, simply out of, not because I was especially clever or had a very advanced sense of understanding literature. It was just a way of surviving, I think. I just needed to read in order to fill myself because I felt I was completely empty. I had no experience, I had no voice, I had no language, but I wanted to write. So, you have the desire, but you don't have all of the other things that are needed to give that desire a life. And the only way to do it is to read as much as you can. So all your experience in those early years really becomes about reading as much as you can as you live. And then slowly your life starts to feel like, okay, you start seeing things because you have that additional lens now of having read. So the voice that you develop can, again, I say this again and again, can only come out of reading widely. And then slowly it's like alchemy, kind of filters into you. And then something starts emerging that doesn't sound like anything that you've read. That is something that is yours. So I think you have to be patient and try it. At least be willing to try. And I'm sure that, the journey would be the same for many writers, that they would have started by reading widely and then slowly finding their voice. So I would say to younger writers, be patient, read widely, be open. Don't be fixed on, I like this genre only, or I like that genre, or I don't read poetry, or I read only poetry. I think be open to all genres. Even though I was a poetry snob, I was reading a lot of fiction. So I didn't think that a novelist was someone I wanted to be. I thought poets are superior, but I did read across genres. So I think the voice is something that will come with time and patience and reading.
Okay, so now, is there anything you want to say?
No, just thank you to the both of you for such intelligent questions and such thoughtful remarks about my writing and about writing in general. So I really enjoyed it. Thanks so much.
Thank you, ma'am, for sharing your journey, your beautiful mind, your beautiful ideas, your beautiful stories.
Okay.
And yeah, we're enlightened by your presence.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Susie. Thank you, Alina.
Thank you, ma'am.